Okay, what do we already know about reflexive verbs? How do we know to recognize a reflexive verb?
Whenever you're doing something, if they end in A or E.
Okay, so they end in SE. Once you take care of the SE, then you're left with a regular verb. What do we do with those SEs at the end of a verb?
Reflexive pronoun.
Okay, and what are our reflexive pronouns? Good. So me, te, se, nos, and se. Where do we put them? If we have one verb in front, if you have two verbs at the end of the second verb, you attach it, it becomes part of the verb. So you still don't conjugate that second verb. That's important for us to remember because today we're not only going to review what we've already talked about, regular reflexive verbs, but we're also going to add to, we already know about conjugations. Now we're adding the reflexive part to it. Today we're going to add one more step of making sure that we make a stem change. Okay? So with regular verbs, I'm going to mention this because this is going to come up when we talk about your homework tonight. You're going to have to decide, do you need a reflexive pronoun in the sentence or do you not? So what's the difference between Mariana baña al perro and Mariana se baña? What does one sentence have that the other one doesn't? The pronoun. So this means what? What does that help us remember?
It's herself.
Right, so the action reflected back to herself. There's going to be an exercise on your homework that's going to ask you, do you need a pronoun or not? Well, if the person's doing whatever the action is to themselves, then yes. If the person is bathing the dog or brushing the dog, then you're going to put an X saying that you don't need a pronoun because the action is not reflected back to the subject. Okay. Remember that we already talked about regular reflexive verbs, and so you have the examples there before the verb, and then if you have two verbs, you're going to attach it at the end of the second one, making sure that you don't conjugate that second verb. Okay. If you're making something negative, just put a no in front of the reflexive pronoun to say that you don't do something. Okay. The new part is taking what we already know about stem changing verbs. Oh, I'm sorry. Technically, we already know about stem changing verbs. What happened with the verb querer when we did it in Spanish 1? Yeah. So if you remember when we talked about it, I called it a boot verb because querer, that E, that first E, changed to I-ing inside the boot shape, which means that the nosotros form was out of the boot, didn't get the change. Okay. Same thing here. We're going to take what we know about querer. We're going to take what we already know about reflexive verbs. We're just going to merge it all together. Okay. So if you look at your vocab list, you have a whole bunch of verbs that happen to have a parentheses next to it. Okay. Also, if you look at the back of your notes, you have a whole bunch of these verbs that have these parentheses all over. Okay. Some of them have the parentheses, some of them don't. What we're going to talk about today are focusing on the verbs that have the parentheses. If they have that, that means you have to do something extra to it, an extra change. Okay. So we're going to take reflexives and put it together with boot changes. The verb acostarse in your vocab has what in the parentheses next to it? It's over here also. It's an O to UE. So anytime you see a UE, what you're going to do is, these are the three types of stem changes. O to UE, so if you see a UE, that's the change you're going to make. E to IE, so if you see an IE, you're going to make that change. And there's one verb that this chapter uses that you can use instead of to put on clothes, which is what from your vocab? Ponerse la ropa. So you can do poner by itself, but if you're making it reflexive, I put on my own clothes, you're going to need to take care of this reflexive part. And remember that poner is also irregular in the yo form. So if that's what's irregular about it, great. If there's something else that's irregular about it, then you're going to add that to it if you see any of these with it. Okay. But an E to I change that we can also use is the verb vestirse. If you notice, it's the only one that has just an I next to it. It's not a typo. It's just another way to say, instead of I put on clothes, that I dress myself. That's basically the same thing. Two different verbs. Okay. So those are the three types of stem changes. Let's look at acostarse. Makes an O to UE change. That O will change to UE. And if you notice, it changes in all the forms except for nosotros and vosotros, which we don't use. Now, your book always likes to give you examples, but they don't give you examples in the side-by-side, which I think makes it less helpful. So, if we were to look at any of these verbs in the actual chart form, then you'll notice that you have the actual boot shape there. So inside the boot, you make the change. Outside of the boot, all that means is that you don't make the change outside of the boot. Okay. So your book just has it in a column. We have it in the actual chart shape. Divertirse has an E to IE change. Again, changes inside the boot. Something in the stem, the beginning part of the verb changes. Boot just means that the nosotros does not change. What happens when you have a verb like despertar, though? What's next to it in your vocab? What's the parentheses tell you to do extra to it? Okay, so it's an IE change. Despertarse happens to have two E's. The rule is, if you have two E's, you're going to use the E closest to the end. So you're going to take care of that SE by doing your me, te, se, no, sen, se. You're going to take care of the AR by doing your conjugations. But then you have to do this extra stem change. The stem is what's left over from once you drop the ending. Okay? So the E that you're going to use to change to IE is going to be that second E, the one that's closest to the end. So far, so good? Okay, and so for that one, if we want to look at it side by side, then you have despertarse is to wake up, and I made this too big. So if you look at it in the boot shape, it makes the change inside the boot. Me despierto, te despiertas, se despierta. Nos despertamos, no change. And se despierta. Excuse me. So go through your vocab list, see any of the verbs that have a parentheses next to it. You're going to need to remember that it makes those types of stem changes. These are the three kinds. The next chapter that we're going to cover is going to only focus on stem changers. Okay. So this is kind of giving you a little taste of it. So far, so good? Okay. What you're going to need to know by Friday is you're going to need to know which verbs make the change. UE and IE are the ones that are used most often. If the verb has that change, it will not have the little parentheses next to it on the quiz. So between today and tomorrow and Friday when we practice this, I want you to get used to which ones have the parentheses, which ones make the change, because you're going to have to distinguish it from all the other ones that don't make the change. So just setting you up for the rest of the week. And these examples right here just show you that if Maria puts on the blouse in her backpack, excuse me, then she's not putting it on herself. So there's no reflexive pronoun there. But if she puts the blouse on herself, then that's where you need the reflexive pronoun. Okay. This is using the verb dormirse, which makes an O to UE change. If you sleep 8 hours, you're not talking about anybody putting themselves to sleep. She falls asleep right away, she actually put herself to sleep, basically. It's a weird concept to think of because we don't normally use this reflexive part of it. Okay. She calls Carlos, no reflexive needed. versus she's called Maria. That's what she calls herself. That's her name. Okay. And divertirse, just another example there, but it's an E to IE change in the conjugation part. No reflexive needed because here you have fun with her friends. She amuses her friends versus she just has fun. She makes herself have fun, basically. Okay. I want to go back to yesterday's sponge that we talked about that had a couple of pictures that we were labeling. And on those pictures, if you remember, we had this girl right here. She was, technically she's yawning, so she could be going to bed or she could be waking up. So for that one, I want you to make sure that you fix it. It's an O to UE change if she's going to bed, or it's an E to IE change if she's waking up. That's on your sponge. So just make sure you have these stem changes correct there so that we, when you go back and look at this as for reference, then you don't have to have something incorrect to look at. Number 3, if you remember on the little paragraph that we did, I'm sorry, not number 3, number 7, she sits at the table. You have to make an E to IE change. Okay. Then go back and find the sheet that we talked about with Jose's routine. Remember that we circled number 6 to come back to it. So number 6 on Jose's daily routine should be using the verb acostarse. You should know the change that it makes. Makes an O to UE change. If the verb has an O and it has a parenthesis next to it, that's the only change that it can make. So fix number 6 to se acuesta. Then on exercise E in the back, you were doing numbers 1, 3, 7, and 8. So fix numbers 1, 3, 7, and 8. Number 1, se despierta. Number 3, te despiertas. Number 7, se acuestan. And why no change for this one, number 8? It's a verb that has a parenthesis next to it. Why is there no change in the conjugation? What does that mean? It's out of the boot. It doesn't get the change. That's why we call it a boot. And then the last one on yesterday's that we went over, number 5, the young man sits. The verb sentarse, you have to make sure you make an IE change there. So far, so good? Okay. All right, so we know about reflexive verbs. We know about stem changers and reflexive verbs together. We fixed yesterday's stuff, papers. I want you to go back and look at your homework. On your homework you have the first section there has just your reflexive pronouns. Just fitting your reflexive pronouns here. I'm going to put the answers up in just a minute. But let me remind you that you have this paper back here, or this chart back here as a reference. Excuse me. And I want you to add right here the verb caerse means to fall or collapse. So add that. That's on your chart on the back of your homework. And it's an irregular yo form. The yo form is caigo. Okay. So to fall or collapse. And then a whole bunch of other things that are irregular, just to remind you. This is just happens to be one of the go verbs that we didn't talk about before. Okay. So if a verb happens to be reflexive and irregular, then you just keep the same thing that's irregular about it. But let's go back and check the front of these. See if I can fit them all on here. Almost. Everybody see that okay? Now, as you're going through your homework last night, you didn't technically know, because we hadn't officially talked about it, to make those stem changes. So like for number 15, make sure you make an IE change, because it's an E to IE change. For number 16, make sure you make an O to UE change. 17 is irregular in the yo form. 20 has an E to I change. 23 has an E to IE. 25 has an E to IE. And on the last section, number 1 has an IE change. Number 3, pongo, yo form, irregular. Number 8, acuesta, UE change. 11, se sienta, IE change. 13, te diviertes, IE change. And 14, me visto, E to I change. And you have that chart as a reference for your irregulars. But we'll start now being familiar with which verbs make which changes, and these are the only changes that they can make. Only in the present tense. Only in the boot, which just means the nosotros is out. Questions so far? Anybody need any part of the homework? Double check. Okay. I'm going to show you a couple of videos, and I want to remind you, if you want to jot down some notes here. If you go to YouTube, just type in the search bar, SenoraMayo, all one word. You don't need the ñ there. You don't need to figure out how to do that ñ. Okay. So if you type in SenoraMayo, it should come up with my channel. You click on my channel, that will have that. Then it'll say browse videos. Click on that link. Once you click on browse videos, it'll give you another link for playlists. What the playlists are basically folders that hold a whole bunch of different videos. And so what I've done is I've done a playlist for each different chapter that we've done. So for this chapter, you would look for the Spanish 2, reflexive stuff. And then once you get there, you're going to have a whole bunch of videos. Okay? So I'm going to give you the option now to watch. There's a couple of videos by Mr. Learn Spanish. And he's got a different name too. Don Tito Frito. There's a whole bunch there to choose from. He just does kind of more interactive stuff. But there's one video that goes over regular reflexives. The second video goes over stem changers. The third video goes over all the verbs. If you have 2 in a row, don't conjugate your second one. So if you have any of these, that would be 2 verbs in a row, right here. You would not make that stem change. You would not conjugate it, and you would attach your pronoun at the end. You wouldn't make any change to it whatsoever. Okay, that's just an extra place to look at for reference there for YouTube stuff.